"We're not finished, Sergeant Vance," he said quietly as she passed him on her way to the door. "This changes nothing." Emily paused, meeting his gaze directly. "With respect, sir, I believe it changes everything." She left Conference Room B with her head high, aware that the events of the past few minutes had altered her trajectory at Fort Bragg in ways she couldn't yet fully comprehend. The demonstration had been meant to end her career. Instead, it might have just launched it in an entirely new direction. But as she walked down the corridor, Montgomery falling into step beside her, Emily's thoughts returned to Dawson's words. "We need to talk about your father. About what really happened in the desert." Her father had never spoken much about his time in Desert Storm. Like many veterans, he had compartmentalized those experiences, sharing only carefully edited versions with his family. But in his final months, as the cancer ate away at his strength, and the morphine loosened his usual reserve, Thomas Vance had begun to speak of things he had never mentioned before. Operations without names. Missions that never officially happened. A bunker in the Iraqi desert, where American soldiers had found something that wasn't supposed to exist. Emily had attributed these stories to the medication and the approaching end. Now she wondered if her father had been trying to tell her something important, something connected to the hostility she had encountered at Fort Bragg, to Hendrix's determination to remove her to the missing pages in those training manuals. "That was incredible," Montgomery said as they exited the administration building into the bright Carolina sunshine. "I've never seen anything like it." "Where did you learn to fight like that, really?" Emily glanced at her new ally, weighing how much to share. "It's a long story, Lieutenant." "Sarah," Montgomery corrected with a smile. "After what just happened, I think we can drop the formalities when it's just us." "Sarah, then," Emily acknowledged, "and it's still a long story." "I've got time," Sarah replied, checking her phone. "And judging by the messages I'm getting, you're about to become the most talked-about soldier on this base. You might want someone watching your back." Emily considered this, thinking of Dawson's words and Hendrix's parting threat. She thought of her father's warning about shadows and flags and values. "I think you might be right about that," Emily said finally. "But first, there's someone I need to talk to." Sergeant Frank Dawson was waiting for them at the edge of the parade ground, his nose still swollen but his eyes clear. He stood alone apart from the normal flow of base activity, watching Emily approach with an expression that combined wariness and resolution. "Sergeant Vance," he said, nodding respectfully. "Lieutenant Montgomery?" "You said we needed to talk," Emily replied, getting straight to the point. "About my father. About the desert." Dawson glanced around, checking for observers before responding. "Not here. Too many eyes, too many ears." He handed her a folded slip of paper. "There's an old gas station about 5 miles off base on Route 87. 8 o'clock tonight. Come alone." Before Emily could respond, Dawson walked away, his posture revealing nothing of the conversation that had just taken place. Sarah looked at Emily, concern evident in her expression. "That sounds suspiciously like the beginning of a horror movie. You're not actually going to meet him alone, are you?" Emily opened the paper, reading the hastily scrawled address. "I don't think he means me harm." "He tried to take your head off less than 30 minutes ago," Sarah pointed out. "That was different. That was a job." Emily folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket. "This is personal. All the more reason not to go alone." Emily considered this, remembering her father's emphasis on strategic thinking, on seeing 3 moves ahead. If Dawson was setting a trap, going alone would be foolish. But if he genuinely had information about her father, about whatever had happened in the desert, that had ended Thomas Vance's promising career, she needed to hear it. "I won't go alone," Emily decided. "I'll bring backup." Sarah nodded, relieved. Good. I'll come with you. Not you, Emily said, her mind already formulating a plan. I need you here monitoring the fallout from that video, keeping an eye on Hendricks. If this goes sideways, someone needs to know where to start looking for answers. Then who? Emily's hand unconsciously moved to her rifle, the weapon that had become an extension of herself through 3 combat deployments. Someone I trust with my life. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the parade ground. In a few hours, darkness would fall, and Emily Vance would drive to an abandoned gas station to learn the truth about her father's past. She didn't know what awaited her there, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: after today's events in Conference Room B, nothing would ever be the same. The trap had been set, sprung, and survived. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had just exchanged one danger for another, something older, deeper, and far more personal than a mere test of combat prowess. As she walked toward her quarters, the weight of her rifle familiar and reassuring against her back, Emily recalled one of her grandfather's favorite sayings: "In war, the first victory is surviving. The second is understanding why someone wanted you dead." She had achieved the first victory in that conference room. Now it was time for the second. The old Sinclair gas station sat like a ghost, at the edge of Route 87, its faded green dinosaur logo barely visible in the gathering twilight. The building had been abandoned for years, its pumps long dry, its windows covered with plywood. Kudzu vines crept up the walls, nature slowly reclaiming what man had discarded. Emily parked her Jeep a quarter-mile down the road, concealing it behind an overgrown billboard advertising a roadside attraction that had closed during the first Bush administration. She approached on foot, moving through the shadows with the practiced silence that had kept her alive in Afghanistan's mountains and Iraq's urban hellscapes. Her rifle was secured in the Jeep. Bringing a military weapon off base without authorization would raise questions she couldn't answer, but she wasn't unarmed. The K-bar knife strapped to her ankle and the Glock 19 holstered at the small of her back were her grandfather's parting gifts when she enlisted. Neither had serial numbers. Neither officially existed. "Just in case," the old man had said, his weathered hands wrapping hers around the knife's handle. "The battlefield isn't always where they tell you it is." The gas station appeared deserted, but Emily's trained eye caught the subtle signs of recent activity: tire tracks in the gravel that hadn't yet been blown away by the wind, a faint light leaking through a crack in the plywood covering the windows. Someone was inside waiting. Emily circled the building twice, identifying exits, lines of sight, potential cover. Only when she was satisfied that there were no obvious ambush points did she approach the main entrance, her hand resting lightly on the grip of her concealed pistol. The door creaked open at her touch, its hinges protesting after years of disuse. Inside, the abandoned convenience store was illuminated by a single battery-powered lantern placed on what had once been the checkout counter. The shelves were empty, the floor covered in dust, except for a set of fresh footprints leading from the door to the counter. Frank Dawson sat on a folding chair behind the lantern, his face partially shadowed, the bruising around his nose dark against his skin. He was alone as promised, and appeared unarmed, though Emily knew better than to make assumptions about a man with his background. "You came," Dawson said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "I wasn't sure you would." "You said you knew something about my father," Emily replied, remaining near the door, maintaining her distance. "That's not the kind of invitation I ignore." Dawson nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "You're like him. Same way of getting straight to the point." He gestured to another folding chair positioned across from him. "Please sit. This might take a while." Emily remained standing. I'll stand until I know what this is about. Fair enough. Dawson shifted slightly, wincing as the movement disturbed his injured nose. First, I want to apologize for today, for being part of Hendrix's setup. I didn't know what it was about until I was already in that room, and by then, he shrugged. Following orders is a hard habit to break. You're a long way from the Navy now, Sergeant, Emily observed. What's a former SEAL doing taking orders from an Army colonel like Hendrix? That's actually part of what I need to tell you about, Dawson replied. But we should start at the beginning, with your father and with Operation Clean Sweep. The name triggered a memory. Thomas Vance, thin and pale in his hospital bed, the morphine drip keeping the cancer pain at bay. His eyes suddenly clear as he gripped Emily's hand with surprising strength. They swept it all away, Em. He had said, his voice a harsh whisper. Buried it in the sand. But sand doesn't keep secrets forever. At the time, Emily had smiled and nodded, humoring what she thought were the confused ramblings of a dying man. Now she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air seeping through the abandoned building's walls. What was Operation Clean Sweep? She asked, her voice steady, despite the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat. Dawson's expression grew solemn. Officially, it never existed. You won't find it in any record, any report, any after-action summary from Desert Storm. But it happened. I was there. Your father was there. And Hendrix, he was the one running the show on the ground. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, or perhaps his courage. It was January 1991. The air campaign was in full swing, but the ground war hadn't started yet. Intelligence had identified a bunker complex near the Kuwait border that supposedly contained chemical weapons. Our unit, Special Operations Detachment Delta. Though that designation was classified at the time, was sent to verify and, if necessary, neutralize the threat. Emily felt another jolt of recognition. Her father had never explicitly mentioned serving in Delta Force, but there had been hints over the years, training absences that weren't explained, deployments that couldn't be discussed, skills that went beyond standard Army doctrine. When we reached the bunker, Dawson continued, we found something else entirely. No chemical weapons. Instead, we discovered documents, training materials, and 16 women. Women, Emily echoed, confusion evident in her voice. Iraqi women, Dawson clarified. But they weren't prisoners. They were soldiers, members of an experimental unit trained in advanced close-quarters combat techniques, techniques that combined traditional martial arts with modern battlefield applications. Techniques designed specifically to allow smaller combatants to neutralize larger, stronger opponents. Understanding began to dawn. Like what I use today. Dawson nodded. Exactly like what you use today. These women had been trained as assassins, specializing in infiltration and elimination of high-value targets. They were incredibly effective, small enough to avoid notice, dismissed as non-threats until it was too late. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. But here's where it gets complicated. These women weren't Saddam's idea. The program they were part of, it originated with us, with the CIA specifically back in the 1950s. The Iraqis had simply acquired the training materials and improved upon them. Emily's mind raced, connecting dots, following implications. The missing pages in those training manuals at the base archive. Yes, Dawson confirmed. After what we found in that bunker, Hendrix and his patron General Whitmore launched a quiet campaign to erase all evidence of those techniques from American military documentation. They argued that such knowledge was dangerous, that it undermined the natural advantage male soldiers had in combat situations. That's ridiculous, Emily said, anger flaring. Effective combat techniques are effective combat techniques regardless of who uses them. I agree, Dawson said. So did your father. But Hendricks and Whitmore saw it differently. They believed that if these techniques became widely known, it would accelerate the push to include women in combat roles, something they were ideologically opposed to. So what happened to the Iraqi women to the documents? Dawson's expression darkened. Operation Clean Sweep. The women were classified as enemy combatants and transferred to a detention facility. The documents were supposedly sent to Langley for analysis, but they never arrived, and everyone involved was sworn to secrecy under threat of court-martial. My father wouldn't have agreed to that, Emily said with certainty. He didn't, Dawson confirmed. Thomas argued that we should be expanding our own training to include these techniques, not burying them. He threatened to go outside the chain of command if Hendricks proceeded with the cover-up. 3 days later, he was transferred to a training post in Oklahoma, his career effectively over. The pieces were falling into place now. Her father's abrupt transfer that had puzzled the family, his sudden interest in teaching Emily and her brother more advanced combat techniques, his cryptic warnings about shadows and flags. And the techniques themselves, Emily asked. If all documentation was erased, how did they survive? Dawson smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his battered face. Your father didn't just threaten to expose the cover-up. Before he was transferred, he memorized as much of the material as he could. He couldn't take the documents, but he took the knowledge. And passed it to my grandfather. Emily finished the final connection, clicking into place. Who taught it to me? Exactly. Dawson nodded. William Vance had already learned similar techniques in Korea. Thomas just expanded his repertoire. Emily finally moved from her position by the door, approaching the counter, but still maintaining a cautious distance. Why are you telling me this now, after all these years? Because history is repeating itself. Dawson said, his expression grim once more. Hendricks and Whitmore, who's now a 3-star general with significant Pentagon influence, have been systematically working to exclude women from combat roles for decades. When they couldn't prevent the policy changes outright, they began creating situations where female soldiers would fail, reinforcing their narrative that women aren't suited for combat. Like today's demonstration, Emily said. Precisely. But you weren't supposed to win, Sergeant Vance. You were supposed to be humiliated, injured, and ultimately removed from your position. Your victory, and more importantly, Lieutenant Montgomery's video of that victory, has thrown a wrench into decades of careful manipulation. So Hendricks set me up because I'm a woman in a combat role. Not just that, Dawson said, shaking his head. He set you up because you're Thomas Vance's daughter, using the very techniques your father died to preserve. You're not just a threat to Hendricks's worldview. You're a living reminder of his greatest failure. Emily processed this information, her tactical mind already analyzing implications, potential threats, possible responses. Why should I believe any of this? For all I know, this could be another setup. Dawson reached slowly into his jacket, telegraphing his movements to avoid alarming Emily. He withdrew a weathered manila envelope and placed it on the counter between them. Because I'm not the only one who's been keeping secrets all these years, he said quietly. Your father left insurance. Emily approached cautiously, picking up the envelope while keeping her eyes on Dawson. Inside was a small leather notebook, its pages filled with her father's distinctive handwriting, along with several photographs showing younger versions of Thomas Vance Frank Dawson and Richard Hendricks standing outside a desert bunker complex. The final item was a microcassette tape, the kind used in dictation recorders in the early 1990s. That's your father's journal from the operation, Dawson explained. The photographs established that we were there despite official records saying otherwise, and the tape, His voice grew softer. "The tape is a recording of the meeting where Hendricks ordered the cover-up, and your father objected. Thomas kept a dictation recorder in his breast pocket during sensitive operations, his own insurance policy." Emily stared at the items, feeling as if she were holding fragments of a history she hadn't known existed, her father's history, but also her own. "Why didn't he use these?" she asked, looking up at Dawson. "If he had evidence of the cover-up, why not expose it?" By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late for his career, Dawson replied. "And then there were other considerations, your family, your safety." Whitmore had powerful connections both inside and outside the military. Thomas decided to bide his time to wait for the right moment. "But that moment never came," Emily said, a heaviness settling in her chest. "No," Dawson agreed solemnly. "The cancer saw to that. But before he died, Thomas entrusted these items to me. 'Give them to Emily,' he said, 'when she's ready, when she needs them.'" Dawson met her gaze directly. "After what I saw today, I'd say you're ready. And given Hendricks's reaction, you definitely need them." Emily carefully returned the items to the envelope, her mind racing with implications. "What happens now?" "That's up to you," Dawson said. "You could use these materials to expose what happened 30 years ago, but that might not accomplish much beyond tarnishing a few reputations. The principals are mostly retired or close to it." "Or," Emily prompted, sensing there was more. "Or you could use them as leverage to address the current situation," Dawson suggested. "Hendricks and Whitmore are still actively working to undermine women in combat roles. That video from today is a powerful counter-narrative, but they'll try to discredit it, to frame it as an anomaly. Unless they're too busy defending themselves against evidence of a decades-old cover-up." Emily finished seeing the strategy. "Exactly," Dawson nodded. "Sometimes the best way to win the current war is to reveal the sins of an old one." Emily tucked the envelope securely inside her jacket, her decision already made. "I'll need allies." "You already have one in Lieutenant Montgomery," Dawson pointed out. "And after today, I suspect Reynolds and the others might be more receptive than you'd expect. Being thoroughly defeated has a way of changing perspectives." "And you?" Emily asked, studying the older soldier's face. "Where do you stand in all this?" Dawson's expression grew solemn. "I've been carrying this guilt for 30 years, Sergeant Vance. I didn't speak up when your father did. I followed orders instead of my conscience. This is my chance to finally make that right." Emily considered this, weighing sincerity against potential deception, measuring risk against necessity. Her father had trusted this man enough to give him those materials. That counted for something. "All right," she said finally. "We'll work together, but I lead this operation." Dawson smiled, standing and offering his hand. "Wouldn't have it any other way, Sergeant. Your father would be proud." As they shook hands, sealing their unlikely alliance, Emily felt a shift in the ground beneath her feet. Not physical, but fundamental. What had begun as a simple transfer to Fort Bragg, followed by an orchestrated attempt to end her career, had transformed into something far larger. She thought of those 5 men in Conference Room B, dispatched in 83 seconds, using techniques that powerful men had tried to erase from history. She thought of her father fighting his own battle against that erasure. She thought of her grandfather passing those techniques to her through years of patient instruction. And she thought of all the women who would come after her, who deserved the chance to serve based on their abilities rather than their gender. The path ahead would not be easy. Hendricks and Whitmore would not surrender their decades-long campaign without a fight. But Emily Vance had never shied away from a fight, especially one where the odds seemed stacked against her. Those were, after all, exactly the conditions under which her training was designed to prevail. Lieutenant Sarah Montgomery was waiting in Emily's small on-base apartment when she returned from the meeting with Dawson. The younger officer sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. "You're back," Sarah said, visible relief in her voice. "I was starting to worry." "Told you I wouldn't be alone," Emily replied, nodding toward the window where her rifle case was clearly visible, propped against the wall. Sarah rolled her eyes. "A weapon isn't the same as backup, Emily." "It's worked for me so far." Emily hung her jacket on the back of a chair, carefully removing the envelope Dawson had given her. "But I wasn't alone. Dawson was there as promised, and he had some interesting information." She placed the envelope on the table, watching as Sarah eyed it curiously. "What's this?" "Evidence," Emily said simply, "of a 30-year cover-up that connects directly to what happened today in that conference room." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "That sounds ominously dramatic." "It's not drama if it's true," Emily countered, opening the envelope and spreading its contents on the table. "My father was involved in a classified operation during Desert Storm, something called Clean Sweep. He and his unit, including Hendricks and Dawson, discovered an Iraqi bunker containing training materials for advanced close-quarters combat techniques specifically designed for smaller combatants." Sarah leaned forward, examining the photographs. "These techniques, they're what you use today." Emily nodded. "My father memorized as much as he could before Hendricks and his superior General Whitmore ordered everything destroyed and classified. He passed the knowledge to my grandfather, who taught me." "Why would they destroy valuable combat techniques?" "Because they were developed specifically for women," Emily explained. "Hendricks and Whitmore saw them as a threat to the natural order of warfare, an order where physical size and strength determined effectiveness." Understanding dawned on Sarah's face. "And if these techniques became widely known, it would undermine their argument that women aren't physically suited for combat roles," Emily finished. "Exactly." Sarah picked up the microcassette, turning it over in her hands. "And this, a recording of the meeting where Hendricks ordered the cover-up, and my father objected," Emily said. "Which is why he was suddenly transferred to a training post in Oklahoma. His career effectively ended." Sarah let out a low whistle. "This is explosive stuff, Emily. If this goes public—" "That's the question," Emily interrupted. "Do we go public? Do we use this to expose a decades-old conspiracy, or do we use it more strategically?" Sarah studied her friend's face, recognizing the tactical calculation in her eyes. "You're thinking of using it as leverage." "I'm considering all options," Emily said carefully. "Today's video has already created ripples. Your live stream has over 200,000 views now. The Army's social media team is trying to frame it as a demonstration of our integrated combat training program, but the comments tell a different story." "People can recognize a setup when they see one," Sarah agreed. "And they love seeing the underdog win." "But Hendricks and Whitmore won't just concede," Emily continued. "They've been working to exclude women from combat roles for decades. They'll try to discredit the video to frame it as an anomaly. Unless they're distracted by their own potential downfall." Sarah surmised, catching up to Emily's thinking. "Blackmail, essentially." Emily frowned. "I prefer to think of it as leverage. We don't want to destroy their careers. We want to change their behavior. And if they refuse to change, then we have options," Emily said, tapping the envelope. "Options they won't like." Sarah considered this, then gestured toward her laptop. "Well, while you were meeting with Dawson, I was doing some digging of my own. Turns out Hendricks and Whitmore aren't just ideological allies. They're connected through something called the Heritage Warrior Foundation. She turned the laptop so Emily could see the screen, which displayed a professional-looking website featuring images of American soldiers in various combat scenarios, all male. It's ostensibly a veterans support organization, Sarah explained, but if you dig deeper, they've filed multiple amicus briefs opposing the integration of women into combat units. They've funded studies purporting to show decreased unit effectiveness with mixed gender compositions, and they've sponsored congressional candidates who share their views. Who funds them? Emily asked, her eyes scanning the website. That's where it gets interesting, Sarah replied, clicking through to another page. Their major donors include several defense contractors who specialize in heavy infantry equipment gear designed specifically for the male physique. Emily's eyes narrowed. So it's not just ideology, it's money. Isn't it always? Sarah closed the laptop. If women in combat roles become the norm, these companies would need to redesign their products, conduct new testing, establish new manufacturing processes, millions in R&D costs they'd rather avoid. Emily leaned back in her chair, processing this new information. The situation was more complex than she had initially thought, not just a matter of outdated attitudes, but a web of financial interests, institutional inertia, and deeply held beliefs about warfare itself. We need a plan, she said finally. Something more comprehensive than just confronting Hendricks with this evidence. What did you have in mind? Sarah asked. Before Emily could answer, her phone vibrated with an incoming text. She checked the screen, surprise registering on her face. It's from Reynolds, she said. He wants to meet. Says he and the others have been talking. They want to learn the techniques I used today. Sarah laughed incredulously. The same guys who tried to pulverize you this morning now want you to teach them? That's quite a turnaround. Professional soldiers respect effectiveness, Emily said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. And what happened today was undeniably effective. She typed a quick reply suggesting a meeting the following morning at the base gym during off hours. Reynolds responded almost immediately with confirmation. So now what? Sarah asked. We have evidence of a decades-old conspiracy connections to current financial interests and 5 former opponents who suddenly want to be students. How do we put all this together into a coherent strategy? Emily was silent for a moment, her mind working through scenarios, evaluating options, calculating risks and rewards. The same mental process she had used countless times behind a sniper rifle, waiting for the perfect moment to take the shot. We start with the 5, she said finally. We turn opponents into allies. Then we approach Hendricks not with threats, but with an opportunity, a chance to be on the right side of history for once. And if he refuses, Emily's expression hardened. Then we go to war, not with bullets and bombs, but with information and influence. We make this about the future of warfare itself, about ensuring American soldiers have every possible advantage regardless of gender. Sarah studied her friend, seeing something new in her demeanor, not just the quiet competence that had always been there, but a sense of purpose, of mission. Your father would be proud, she said softly. Emily glanced at the photograph on her nightstand, Thomas Vance in his dress uniform, his expression serious but his eyes kind. The picture had been taken just before his final deployment, before the cancer diagnosis, before everything changed. He spent his career fighting for what he believed was right, Emily said. Even when it cost him everything, I can do no less. She gathered the materials back into the envelope, securing it in a locked drawer in her desk. Tomorrow would begin a new phase in a battle that had started 30 years ago in a desert bunker, a battle not just for Emily's career, but for the future of warfare itself. As she prepared for bed, Emily recalled something her grandfather had told her during one of their training sessions when she was struggling with a particularly difficult technique. The most powerful weapon in any fight, the old soldier had said, is not the gun or the knife or even the fist. It's the mind that controls them. Train your mind to see possibilities where others see only obstacles, and you'll never truly be defeated. In Conference Room B, Emily had demonstrated the physical applications of her training. Now it was time to apply the strategic principles to see the possibilities in this situation that others might miss. Hendricks and Whitmore had decades of influence, institutional support, and financial backing. But Emily had something more valuable, the truth preserved by her father's foresight, protected by his sacrifice, and now placed in her hands at exactly the moment when it could make the most difference. As she drifted toward sleep, Emily felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. The path ahead was uncertain, the opposition formidable, but for the first time since arriving at Fort Bragg, she felt as if she were exactly where she was meant to be, fighting exactly the battle she was meant to fight. Not just for herself, but for her father's memory, for every woman who would come after her, and for the principle that effectiveness in combat should be measured by results, not by gender. The trap that had been set for her in Conference Room B had failed spectacularly. Now it was her turn to set the terms of engagement. The base gym was deserted at 0500, the cavernous space silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the occasional creak of cooling equipment. Emily arrived early, methodically arranging crash mats on the floor, creating a training space that would minimize the risk of injury while still allowing for realistic practice. She moved with the fluid economy that characterized all her actions, conserving energy, eliminating unnecessary motion. Her training clothes, gray Army PT shirt and black shorts, were standard issue, but she wore them with a quiet dignity that transformed the simple uniform into something more. At precisely 05:15, the gym doors opened, and 5 men entered. Reynolds led the group, his massive frame seeming even larger in the empty space. Behind him came Bell, Harris, Ramirez, and Dawson, each moving with the careful respect of men approaching something they didn't fully understand, but recognized as important. "Sergeant Vance," Reynolds said, his usual boisterous confidence tempered into something more thoughtful. "Thank you for agreeing to meet us." Emily nodded, studying the 5 men who had been her opponents less than 24 hours earlier. They were subdued, their earlier arrogance replaced by a cautious curiosity. Even Harris, whose MMA background had given him the greatest confidence, seemed genuinely interested rather than skeptical. "Before we begin," Emily said, "I need to understand what you're looking for. Are you here out of curiosity, professional interest, or something else?" The men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. It was Dawson who answered, his voice carrying the weight of his experience. "After what happened yesterday, we've been doing some thinking," he said. "Each of us has spent years, decades, in some cases, honing our combat skills. We've trained with the best instructors in the most advanced programs the military offers. And yet you neutralized all 5 of us in less than a minute." He paused, his expression serious. "That's not just a defeat. That's a paradigm shift. If what you did is teachable, if it can be integrated into our existing skill sets, it would be professional malpractice to ignore it." The others nodded in agreement, even Reynolds, whose pride had taken the most visible beating. "What you did to me shouldn't have been possible," the big man said, a hint of wonder still in his voice. "I outweigh you by 150 pounds. I bench press 350 for reps. But you put me down like I was a child. I need to understand how." Emily considered their words, looking for deception, for hidden agendas, for the subtle tells that would indicate this was another setup. She found none, only the genuine respect of professionals who had witnessed something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about combat. "All right," she said finally. We'll start with the basics. The techniques I used are built on three core principles: leverage, timing, and targeting. Size and strength are factors, but they're not determinative. Position, precision, and anticipation matter more. She moved to the center of the mat, gesturing for Reynolds to join her. The big man approached cautiously, his movements betraying a new wariness that hadn't been present in Conference Room B. The first principle is leverage, Emily explained, positioning Reynolds with his arm extended. Every human body, regardless of size, has mechanical vulnerabilities, points where even a small force correctly applied can overcome much greater opposing force. She demonstrated using Reynolds's own arm as a lever, smoothly taking him to the ground with seemingly minimal effort. The big man found himself looking up at the ceiling, momentarily disoriented by how quickly his balance had been compromised. The second principle is timing. Emily continued, helping Reynolds back to his feet. Strength requires time to deploy. By intercepting an opponent's motion at precisely the right moment, you can neutralize their strength advantage before it becomes relevant. She had Reynolds throw a slow-motion punch, demonstrating how to step inside the arc of his swing where his superior reach became a liability rather than an asset. The final principle is targeting, Emily said, pointing to specific areas on Reynolds's body. The human nervous system has universal vulnerabilities. Pressure points, nerve clusters, structural weaknesses that exist regardless of size or strength. By focusing force on these targets, a smaller combatant can achieve disproportionate results. For the next hour, Emily guided the 5 men through basic exercises, correcting form, explaining concepts, building a foundation of understanding. They were attentive students, their earlier skepticism completely dissolved in the face of demonstrable effectiveness. As they practiced, Emily found herself evaluating each man's potential. Reynolds had surprising dexterity for his size, his football background giving him better body awareness than she had initially credited. Bell struggled with the timing aspects, but grasped leverage concepts quickly. Harris, with his MMA experience, adapted fastest, integrating the new techniques with his existing skill set. Ramirez's wrestling background provided an excellent foundation for the balance and weight distribution principles. And Dawson, the most experienced of the group, approached each lesson with the methodical patience of a man who had learned many combat systems over his career. By 06:30, all 5 were sweating, breathing hard, but energized by what they were learning. Colonel Richard Hendricks sat alone in his office, the blinds drawn against the morning sun, a tumbler of bourbon on his desk despite the early hour. His computer screen displayed Lieutenant Montgomery's video, which had now surpassed 500,000 views and was being shared across military social media channels with astonishing speed. The comments section was a battlefield. Hendricks had no idea how to navigate thousands of voices, most of them celebrating Vance's victory, many questioning why 5 men had been pitted against 1 woman in the first place. 34 years in the United States Army, and his legacy might well be reduced to this: the man who orchestrated a humiliating spectacle that backfired in the most public way possible. His phone rang, the secure line used only for sensitive communications. Hendricks stared at it for 3 rings before picking up, already knowing who would be on the other end. "Hendricks!" he answered, his voice betraying none of the turmoil churning inside him. "What the hell were you thinking?" The voice of Lieutenant General James Whitmore filled the small office, cold fury evident in every syllable. 5 against 1, Richard. And you recorded it. "Sir, the demonstration was meant to—" "I know what it was meant to do," Whitmore cut him off. "It was meant to eliminate Thomas Vance's daughter from the equation. Instead, you've turned her into a goddamn recruitment poster." Hendricks winced. He had known Whitmore would be displeased, but the raw anger in the general's voice was unexpected. "The situation can still be contained," Hendricks said with more confidence than he felt. "We can frame the narrative, suggest it was a staged demonstration." "It's too late for that," Whitmore interrupted again. "The Pentagon is already fielding calls from senators on the Armed Services Committee. The Secretary of the Army wants a briefing, and CNN is running a segment tonight on changing perceptions of women in combat roles." Hendricks felt the floor shifting beneath him. This was worse than he had anticipated. Much worse. "Sir, about Operation Clean Sweep." "Don't say that name," Whitmore hissed, real fear replacing anger for a moment. "Not over the phone, not in your office, not anywhere. That matter was resolved 30 years ago. It has no bearing on the current situation." But Hendricks wasn't so sure. The way Vance had fought the techniques she had used, they were too similar to what they had found in that desert bunker. Techniques that had supposedly been erased from military records, from institutional memory itself. "Sir, I believe Vance may have knowledge of the classified material we contained during Desert Storm." A long silence followed, broken only by the sound of Whitmore's breathing, suddenly heavier. "That's not possible," the general said finally. "Thomas Vance had no access to those documents after they were secured." "He didn't need the documents if he memorized the techniques," Hendricks pointed out. "And if he passed that knowledge to his daughter—" Another silence, longer this time. When Whitmore spoke again, his voice had changed, the anger replaced by cold calculation. "Find out what she knows," he ordered. "And who else she might have told. This goes beyond your little demonstration, Richard. If those techniques are being circulated, if the origin of those techniques becomes public knowledge—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Both men understood the implications all too well. "I'll handle it, sir," Hendricks promised. "See that you do," Whitmore replied, "because if this explodes, I won't be the only one buried in the rubble." The line went dead. Hendricks stared at the phone for a long moment, then at his computer screen, where the video continued to play on mute. Emily Vance at the center of the frame, 5 of his best men scattered around her like debris after a tornado. He reached for the bourbon, downing it in a single swallow. The situation had evolved from a simple career-ending humiliation to something far more dangerous. A potential disclosure of secrets buried in the Iraqi desert 3 decades ago. Secrets that could end more than careers if they came to light. Hendricks opened his desk drawer, removing a small leather-bound notebook. Inside were names, contact information, and cryptic annotations, his personal record of the network he and Whitmore had built over the years. Men who shared their vision of warfare, their concern about the social experimentation threatening America's fighting forces. Men who would understand the gravity of the current situation. He began to make calls. The base gym had become Emily's domain each morning at 0500. What had begun as a one-time meeting with her former opponents had evolved into a regular training session, now expanded to include a dozen additional soldiers who had heard rumors about the new techniques being taught in the pre-dawn hours. Lieutenant Montgomery stood at the edge of the mat, recording the session on her phone, not for social media this time, but for documentation. The video from Conference Room B had sparked something unexpected. A grassroots interest in combat techniques that emphasized efficiency over brute force. The human brain processes threats based on pattern recognition, Emily explained to the assembled soldiers. When a larger opponent confronts a smaller one, both parties fall into predictable patterns. The larger combatant expects to overwhelm with superior force. The smaller combatant typically attempts to evade. She gestured for Reynolds to join her at the center of the mat. The big man moved forward, his initial wariness now replaced by genuine enthusiasm for what he was learning. The key to defeating a larger opponent is to disrupt these patterns, Emily continued, to move toward threat rather than away from it, to engage at unexpected angles, to strike at targets the opponent doesn't prioritize protecting. She demonstrated moving inside Reynolds's reach with a fluid motion that placed her directly against his chest. Her hands positioned at specific pressure points that would, if fully applied, cause temporary paralysis in his arms. From this position, Sergeant Reynolds's superior strength is neutralized, Emily explained. His longer reach becomes irrelevant, and his greater mass actually works against him, making recovery of balance more difficult. With a subtle shift of weight and pressure, she sent Reynolds stumbling backward, his arms momentarily useless at his sides. The watching soldiers murmured appreciatively. "Remember," Emily said, helping Reynolds regain his balance, "these techniques aren't about who's stronger. They're about who's smarter, who understands biomechanics, neurological vulnerabilities, and the psychology of combat." As the session continued, Emily noted with satisfaction how quickly her students were progressing. Reynolds, in particular, had become her most dedicated pupil, his football-trained mind rapidly grasping concepts of leverage and momentum. Bell had overcome his initial difficulties with timing and now moved with surprising grace for a powerlifter. Harris was incorporating the new techniques into his MMA background, creating a hybrid style that was particularly effective. Ramirez had mastered the targeting aspects, his wrestler's precision allowing him to strike nerve clusters with unerring accuracy. And Dawson, always the most reserved of the group, watched everything with the calculating eye of a man assembling pieces of a larger puzzle. After the training session concluded and the other soldiers had dispersed to their regular duties, Emily's original 5 opponents remained behind, along with Lieutenant Montgomery. They gathered in a corner of the gym, away from potential observers. "We need to talk about Hendricks," Dawson said without preamble. "He's making moves." Emily raised an eyebrow. "What kind of moves?" "He's been making calls to retired officers, former commanders with significant influence," Dawson explained. "Men who share his perspective on women in combat roles." "How do you know this?" Harris asked, suspicion evident in his tone. Dawson's expression remained neutral. "I still have contacts from my SEAL days. People talk especially when they're worried." "And what are they saying?" Emily pressed. "That Hendricks is gathering support for something big," Dawson replied. "Something that goes beyond your case, Sergeant Vance. He's using what happened in Conference Room B as evidence of a larger problem, arguing that specialized training is creating a false equivalency between male and female combat capabilities." Reynolds frowned. "That's ridiculous. What you're teaching us works regardless of who's implementing it." "That's exactly the problem from Hendricks's perspective," Montgomery interjected. "If these techniques become standard, if they're integrated into regular combat training, then the physical advantages male soldiers have traditionally relied on become less relevant. And the arguments against women in combat roles get weaker," Bell concluded, understanding dawning on his face. Emily nodded, the pieces aligning with what Dawson had told her about Operation Clean Sweep. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about the future of combat training itself." "So what do we do?" Ramirez asked, looking around the circle. "Hendricks is a full colonel with 3 decades of connections. We're just a handful of enlisted personnel and a junior officer. We have something Hendricks doesn't," Emily said, her voice quiet but firm. "The truth. About what happened 30 years ago, about why these techniques were buried, about the real reasons behind his opposition to women in combat roles." She looked at Dawson, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded slightly, understanding her intent. "It's time to bring everyone up to speed," Emily decided. "If we're going to face what's coming, you all need to know what we're really fighting against and why." For the next 20 minutes, Emily and Dawson took turns explaining Operation Clean Sweep the Bunker in the Iraqi Desert. the combat techniques developed specifically for smaller combatants, and the systematic effort to erase them from military doctrine. They described Thomas Vance's opposition to the cover-up, his subsequent transfer, and his decision to preserve the techniques by teaching them to his father, who had passed them on to Emily. When they finished, a heavy silence settled over the group. Reynolds was the first to break it. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly. "Hendricks and his buddy General Whitmore have been working for 30 years to keep these techniques suppressed because they're afraid it would help women qualify for combat roles." "That's part of it," Emily confirmed. "But there's more. The Heritage Warrior Foundation that Hendricks and Whitmore are involved with has financial connections to defense contractors who specialize in equipment designed specifically for the male physique. If combat roles become more accessible to women, those contractors would face significant R&D costs to adapt their products. So it's not just ideology," Harris said, disgust evident in his voice. "It's money, always money." "Both," Dawson corrected. "The ideology creates the motivation, but the money provides the means. Together, they're a powerful combination." "And now Hendricks is mobilizing his network," Montgomery added, "using what happened in Conference Room B as a rallying cry for those who share his views." Bell leaned forward, his massive forearms resting on his knees. "I don't understand something. If these techniques are so effective, and after what I've experienced this week, I can testify that they are, why wouldn't the military want them widely taught? Regardless of the gender issue, wouldn't more effective combat techniques be a good thing?" "You're thinking like a soldier," Emily replied. "Not like a bureaucrat with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo." Ramirez nodded slowly. "So what's our next move? We can't just keep training in secret and hope Hendricks doesn't shut us down." Emily exchanged glances with Dawson and Montgomery, a silent communication passing between them. They had discussed this question extensively over the past few days, weighing options, evaluating risks, considering potential outcomes. "We go public," Emily said finally. "Not with the full story, not yet, but with the techniques themselves. We create a formal proposal for integrating them into standard combat training, complete with documentation of their effectiveness, historical context, and potential applications." "Hendricks will block it," Dawson warned. "He has the authority to prevent any training modification proposals from moving up the chain of command." "He can block official channels," Montgomery agreed. "But he can't block social media. The video from Conference Room B was just the beginning. Imagine what happens when we release instructional content demonstrating these techniques, content featuring not just Emily, but all of you as well." Reynolds's eyes widened as he grasped the strategy. "You want to create so much public interest that the brass can't ignore it. Force them to address it officially." "Exactly," Emily confirmed. "The Army is ultimately accountable to the American people. If enough soldiers are asking why these techniques aren't being taught, if enough civilians are questioning the decision to suppress effective combat methods, the pressure becomes too great to maintain the status quo." "It's risky," Harris pointed out. "We could all face disciplinary action for unauthorized training activities." "Worth it," Bell said immediately. "These techniques could save lives. That matters more than our careers." Ramirez nodded in agreement. "I'm in, whatever it takes." One by one, the others voiced their support, even Dawson, who had the most to lose, given his longer service record. Emily felt a surge of emotion as she looked at these men, her former opponents, now her most committed allies. They had been selected specifically for their physical prowess, chosen as instruments of her humiliation. Instead, they had become partners in something much larger than any of them had anticipated. "All right," she said, a new resolve in her voice. "Let's get to work. Montgomery, you'll handle the media strategy. Reynolds, you and Bell will draft the training proposal, focus on the technical aspects, the biomechanics, the efficiency metrics. Harris and Ramirez start developing a simplified curriculum for basic training integration. Dawson, you're with me. What are you two going to do? Montgomery asked. Emily's expression hardened. We're going to prepare for Hendrix's response. Because once we start this, there's no going back. And he won't go down without a fight. As the group dispersed, each member focused on their assigned tasks. Emily felt the weight of what they were undertaking. This had begun as a personal battle, a defense of her career, her capabilities, her right to serve in the role she had earned. It had evolved into something far larger, a challenge to entrenched interests, to decades of institutional resistance, to the very definition of combat effectiveness itself. In Conference Room B, she had demonstrated what one woman could do against 5 men, determined to defeat her. Now she was about to discover what 6 soldiers united by a common purpose could accomplish against an entire system designed to maintain the status quo. The next 83 seconds had lasted less than a minute and a half. The coming battle would be measured in days, perhaps weeks. But Emily Vance had never shied away from a protracted engagement, especially not when the stakes were this high. The video went live at 0600 on a Monday morning, posted simultaneously across multiple social media platforms. Unlike the raw footage from Conference Room B, this was a professionally edited training demonstration featuring Emily and her 5 former opponents, demonstrating the core techniques of what they had begun calling the integrated combat system. Lieutenant Montgomery had outdone herself with the production. The video began with a brief historical overview of combat techniques designed for smaller combatants, carefully avoiding any mention of Operation Clean Sweep or the Iraqi bunker. It then transitioned to practical demonstrations with Reynolds, the largest of the group, serving as the primary example of how size advantages could be neutralized through proper technique. Each segment was clear, concise, and undeniably effective. The final sequence showed all 6 instructors working with a diverse group of soldiers, men and women, of various sizes and physical capabilities, all successfully implementing the techniques against larger opponents. The video concluded with a simple message: combat effectiveness isn't determined by size. It's determined by training. Isn't it time our training reflected that reality? By noon, the video had accumulated over 100,000 views. By 1500, it had surpassed 500,000. Comments poured in from active duty soldiers, veterans, and civilians alike, most expressing amazement at the effectiveness of the techniques and questioning why they weren't already part of standard training. Military-focused blogs picked up the story, followed by mainstream news outlets. By evening, the video had been featured on several national news programs, often paired with discussions about the evolving role of women in combat and the military's adaptation to changing social expectations. Emily watched the response unfold from the small desk in her quarters, monitoring various platforms on her laptop, while Montgomery provided regular updates via text. The scale and speed of the reaction exceeded even their most optimistic projections. "This is working better than we anticipated," Dawson observed, looking over Emily's shoulder at the view counter, which continued to climb at an astonishing rate. "People respond to effectiveness," Emily replied. "These techniques work. That's undeniable, regardless of where you stand on the broader issues." Her phone rang, an unknown number with a Washington, D.C. area code. Emily exchanged glances with Dawson before answering. "Sergeant Vance," she said, her voice neutral. "Sergeant, this is Major Rebecca Collins' office of the Secretary of the Army." The woman's voice was crisp, professional, with the slightly hurried cadence of someone working in the Pentagon. "Your video has attracted significant attention at the highest levels. The secretary would like to arrange a briefing on these combat techniques at your earliest convenience. Emily kept her expression carefully blank, though her pulse quickened. I'm available at the secretary's convenience, ma'am. Excellent. Please hold for transfer to scheduling. As Emily worked out the details for a video conference scheduled for the following morning, Dawson moved to the window, peering through the blinds at the parking lot below. "We've got company," he said quietly as Emily ended her call. "Hendricks just pulled up, and he's not alone." Emily joined him at the window. Colonel Hendricks was emerging from his staff car, accompanied by two men in civilian clothes, whose bearing, nonetheless, marked them as military, probably higher-ranking officers in unmarked vehicles. "Looks like we got someone's attention," Emily remarked, her voice calm despite the tension evident in her posture. "Multiple someones," Dawson corrected. "Those aren't just any officers with Hendricks. The one on the left is General Whitmore himself." Emily studied the older man with new interest. So this was the architect of Operation Clean Sweep, the man whose ideology had ended her father's career and nearly destroyed hers. In person, Lieutenant General James Whitmore looked unremarkable, mid-60s, silver-haired, with the trim physique of a man who maintained military standards long after they were required of him. Nothing in his appearance suggested the decades-long campaign he had waged against women in combat roles. "And the other one?" Emily asked, noting the second man's more substantial build and the deference with which both Hendricks and Whitmore treated him. "Don't recognize him," Dawson admitted. "But judging by how Whitmore's positioning himself, that's someone even further up the food chain." Emily's phone buzzed with a text from Montgomery. "Heads up, the old guard is mobilizing. Multiple calls from Pentagon to base command. Something big is happening." They're not waiting for the secretary's briefing, Emily realized. They're moving to contain this now. Her phone rang again, the base commander's office requesting her immediate presence. No explanation given, just a direct order to report. "Looks like we're about to find out what they have planned," Emily said, straightening her uniform. "Ready." Dawson's expression was grim but determined. "As ready as I'll ever be to confront three of the most powerful men in the military establishment." "Remember," Emily said as they prepared to leave her quarters, "they wouldn't be here in person if they weren't worried. That means we've already achieved something significant." "Or we've painted targets on our backs," Dawson countered. Emily checked her appearance one last time in the mirror, ensuring every detail of her uniform was perfect. Whatever was about to happen, she would face it with the same disciplined precision she brought to every aspect of her military service. "Either way," she said, "there's no turning back now." The base commander's office was located in the main administration building, a stately brick structure that dated back to World War II. As Emily and Dawson approached, they noticed the increased security presence: MPs at the entrances, plain-clothed personnel, who were almost certainly counterintelligence officers positioned at key points throughout the building. "Quite a reception committee," Dawson murmured as they passed through a security checkpoint that hadn't been there the previous day. "They're worried about more than just our video," Emily replied quietly. "They're worried about what else we might know and who else we might have told." They were escorted directly to the commander's conference room rather than his office, a space typically reserved for high-level briefings and sensitive discussions. When they entered, Emily immediately understood why. Seated around the massive oak table were not only Colonel Hendricks and the two men they had observed from the window, but also 4 additional officers wearing the insignia of various special operations commands. The base commander, a usually confident brigadier general named Walsh, looked distinctly uncomfortable at the far end of the table, as if he were a guest rather than the host in his own conference room. "Sergeant Vance, Sergeant Dawson," General Walsh said, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. "Thank you for reporting promptly. Please, be seated." Emily and Dawson took the only two empty chairs directly across from Hendricks and Whitmore. The unknown civilian-clothed man sat at the head of the table, his expression impassive as he studied the new arrivals. "Sergeant Vance," this man said after a moment of silence, "I'm General Victor Hargrove, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff." Emily maintained her composure, though the revelation that the highest-ranking military officer in the United States had personally come to Fort Bragg was staggering. This was no longer merely about a training video or even about Operation Clean Sweep. This had escalated to the highest levels of national security. "Sir," she acknowledged, her voice steady. "It's an honor." "Let's dispense with pleasantries, Sergeant," Hargrove replied, his tone neither hostile nor friendly, simply direct. "Your video has created quite a stir in Washington. The Secretary of Defense has received calls from 16 senators and 27 representatives in the past 6 hours. The President's Chief of Staff has requested a briefing, and I've had to postpone meetings with 3 foreign defense ministers to be here today." He leaned forward slightly. "So perhaps you can explain to me why a staff sergeant and 5 enlisted men decided to bypass the entire chain of command and release unauthorized training materials to the public without so much as a courtesy notification to their immediate superiors." Before Emily could respond, Hendricks interjected barely contained anger in his voice. "Sir, if I may, this is clearly a disciplinary matter. Sergeant Vance has a history of insubordination, and—" Colonel Hargrove cut him off. "I didn't fly from Washington to listen to your assessment. I'm here to hear directly from Sergeant Vance." Hendricks subsided, though the look he directed at Emily contained pure venom. Emily met Hargrove's gaze directly. "Sir, the techniques demonstrated in our video represent a significant advancement in close-quarters combat training techniques that have been systematically excluded from standard doctrine despite their proven effectiveness." "And how did you come to possess these techniques, Sergeant?" Whitmore asked, speaking for the first time. "They aren't taught in any official capacity." "I learned them from my grandfather, sir," Emily replied, the practiced answer coming smoothly. "He developed them based on his experiences in Korea, where he encountered similar methods used by local fighters. My father refined them further based on his own combat experience and passed them to me." It wasn't entirely false. Her grandfather had indeed learned combat techniques in Korea. The lineage from there to her father, and then to her, was accurate. She simply omitted the Iraqi bunker, the classified documents, and Operation Clean Sweep from the narrative. Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the omission, but unable to challenge it directly without revealing what he knew about the operation's true origins. "Regardless of their provenance," Hargrove said, bringing the focus back to the present situation, "releasing unauthorized training materials through social media represents a serious breach of protocol, Sergeant, one that could potentially carry significant consequences for your career." "With respect, sir," Emily responded, "protocol also dictates that combat techniques with demonstrated effectiveness should be evaluated for potential integration into standard training. Our attempts to pursue that process through official channels were systematically blocked." She glanced at Hendricks. "When conventional paths are obstructed, unconventional measures sometimes become necessary." Hargrove studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. "Your point is taken, Sergeant. Though your methods are questionable, your commitment to improving combat effectiveness is noted." He turned to one of the Special Operations officers. "Colonel Mitchell, your assessment." A lean, hard-faced man in his 50s leaned forward. "The techniques are valid, sir. Our analysts have been reviewing the video since it was posted. The biomechanical principles are sound, the application is efficient, and the potential for integration into existing training frameworks is significant." Would you recommend adoption into special operations training? Hargrove pressed. Mitchell didn't hesitate. Without reservation, sir. In fact, I'd argue we're already behind the curve. These techniques have clear applications for situations where our operators are physically disadvantaged. Urban environments, close quarters scenarios, situations where traditional strength advantages are neutralized by environmental factors. Several of the other special operations officers nodded in agreement. Emily kept her expression neutral, but internally she felt a surge of validation. These were men who dealt in practical reality, not ideology or politics. They recognized effective techniques when they saw them, regardless of the source. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. This was clearly not proceeding as he had anticipated. Sir, while the techniques may have tactical applications in specific scenarios, there are broader implications to consider. The physical standards for combat roles have been established based on decades of battlefield experience. Introducing methods that potentially circumvent those standards could have unforeseen consequences for unit cohesion and overall combat effectiveness. Is that your professional assessment, General? Hargrove asked. Or your position as a board member of the Heritage Warrior Foundation? Whitmore blanched. Sir, my involvement with that organization is entirely separate from my military duties. Is it? Hargrove's voice had acquired a dangerous edge. Because my staff has been quite busy since this video surfaced, General. They've discovered some interesting connections between that foundation, certain defense contractors, and a pattern of policy positions that align remarkably well with both entities' financial interests. The room fell silent. Emily glanced at Dawson, whose carefully blank expression didn't quite hide his surprise at this turn of events. They had expected resistance, perhaps even punishment. They hadn't expected the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to essentially side with them against Whitmore and Hendricks. Hargrove turned his attention back to Emily. Sergeant Vance, while I cannot condone your method of bringing these techniques to light, I am not blind to the obstacles you likely faced in pursuing official channels. Effective combat techniques should be evaluated on their merits, not filtered through ideological or financial interests. He stood signaling the end of the meeting. Colonel Mitchell will coordinate with you to develop a formal training proposal for these techniques to be submitted directly to my office. General Whitmore, Colonel Hendricks. I expect your full cooperation in this matter. Any obstruction will be viewed as contrary to the combat readiness interests of the United States military. Whitmore and Hendricks could only nod, effectively neutralized by the chairman's direct involvement. The other officers began gathering their materials. The meeting clearly concluded. As Emily and Dawson prepared to leave, Hargrove approached them, speaking quietly so only they could hear. Impressive work, Sergeant Vance. Your father would be proud. Emily froze, the casual reference to her father striking her like a physical blow. Sir. Hargrove's expression softened slightly. Thomas Vance was a good man. He tried to do the right thing 30 years ago at significant personal cost. I was a captain then, too junior to intervene effectively. I'm not too junior anymore. With that cryptic statement, he moved away, rejoining the other officers as they exited the conference room. Emily and Dawson walked in stunned silence back to the base housing area. Only when they were safely inside Emily's quarters did they allow themselves to process what had just occurred. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dawson said, shaking his head in disbelief. Not just involved, but actively supporting us. And he knew your father. This is bigger than we realized, Emily agreed, trying to reconcile this unexpected development with their understanding of the situation. Hargrove mentioned being a captain 30 years ago. He would have been in the chain of command somewhere, maybe not directly involved in Operation Clean Sweep, but aware of it. And apparently sympathetic to your father's position, Dawson added, which means there were others who opposed the cover-up even back then. Emily's phone buzzed with an incoming text from Montgomery. You won't believe the latest. Video has gone viral internationally. Foreign military attaches requesting information. And someone just leaked internal Pentagon emails showing Whitmore actively blocking similar techniques from being evaluated in 2017. This is nuclear. She showed the message to Dawson, whose eyebrows rose. It's not just Hargrove, then. Someone inside the Pentagon is actively helping us. Someone with access to Whitmore's emails. The question is, why now? Emily mused. These techniques have been suppressed for 30 years. What changed? Dawson considered this. Maybe nothing changed. Maybe they were just waiting for the right catalyst. He nodded toward Emily. For someone like you to come along, someone with the skills to demonstrate the techniques convincingly, the moral authority to advocate for them effectively, and the personal connection to make it meaningful. Emily wasn't entirely comfortable with this characterization, but she couldn't deny the logic. The video from Conference Room B had created the initial spark. The training demonstration they had released had fanned that spark into a flame. And now, with Hargrove's involvement, that flame threatened to become a conflagration that would consume decades of systematic suppression. So what happens next? She asked more to herself than to Dawson. We work with Colonel Mitchell to formalize the training program, Dawson replied pragmatically. We document everything, create a comprehensive curriculum, and establish metrics for effectiveness. We do exactly what Hargrove has authorized us to do. And Hendricks, Whitmore? Dawson's expression hardened. They've been contained for now, but men like that don't surrender easily. They'll regroup, find another angle, try to undermine the process from within. Then we need to be ready, Emily said, her resolve strengthening. This isn't just about getting these techniques adopted anymore. It's about ensuring they can't be suppressed again when attention shifts elsewhere. Her phone rang, Lieutenant Montgomery calling rather than texting for the first time that day. Emily, Montgomery said without preamble, her voice tight with controlled urgency. You need to turn on the news, right now. Emily switched on the small television in her quarters, tuning to the news channel Montgomery specified. The screen showed a press conference in progress at the Pentagon with the Secretary of Defense himself at the podium. In light of recent developments and compelling evidence of the effectiveness of these techniques, I am ordering a comprehensive review of our close-quarters combat training protocols with the goal of integrating these methods across all service branches. The days of defining combat effectiveness solely in terms of physical size and strength are behind us. The modern battlefield demands a more sophisticated approach, one that recognizes that intelligence, technique, and precision are often more decisive factors than raw power. The Secretary paused, looking directly into the cameras. To Staff Sergeant Emily Vance and her colleagues at Fort Bragg, I extend the nation's gratitude for your commitment to improving our war-fighting capabilities. Your demonstration has initiated a long-overdue conversation about the future of combat training in the United States military. Emily sat heavily on the edge of her bed, the magnitude of what was happening finally hitting her with full force. What had begun as a personal defense against Hendricks's attempt to end her career had evolved into something that would potentially reshape combat training for generations of American soldiers. Holy hell! Dawson breathed, equally stunned by the Secretary's announcement. They're not just adopting the techniques, they're making them the new standard. Montgomery's voice came through the phone, still on speaker. Emily, you did it. You actually did it. But Emily's thoughts were elsewhere, with her father, who had sacrificed his career to preserve these techniques, with her grandfather, who had patiently taught them to her throughout her childhood, with the unnamed women from that Iraqi bunker 30 years ago, whose existence had been erased from official records, but whose legacy might now transform the very institution that had once denied them. No, she said quietly. We did it, all of us. And we're just getting started. The old farm sat abandoned at the end of a gravel road 20 miles outside Fort Bragg, its weathered barn and faded farmhouse bearing silent witness to decades of changing fortunes. Once the proud homestead of the Vance family, it had been left to the elements after William Vance's passing. 5 years earlier, its fields untended, its structures slowly surrendering to nature's reclamation. Emily stood in what had once been the living room dust motes, dancing in the shafts of late afternoon sunlight that penetrated the grimy windows. This place had been the setting for her earliest memories. Summer visits to her grandparents, learning to shoot a .22 rifle under her grandfather's watchful eye. Listening to the old man's stories of Korea, while her grandmother baked apple pies in the kitchen. And it had been here in the converted barn behind the house that William Vance had taught his granddaughter the techniques that would one day change the course of military training doctrine. Techniques passed down from her father, preserved through the old man's patient instruction, refined through thousands of hours of practice. This is where it all began, Emily said softly, addressing the 4 people who had accompanied her to this forgotten corner of North Carolina: Dawson, Montgomery, Reynolds, and, surprisingly, Colonel Mitchell from Special Operations Command. "Your grandfather taught you here?" Mitchell asked, his professional interest evident as he surveyed the modest surroundings. Emily nodded. "In the barn, mostly. He converted part of it into a training space, mats on the floor, some basic equipment. Nothing fancy, but it served its purpose." "Why bring us here?" Reynolds asked, his massive frame seeming out of place among the dusty furniture and faded photographs. "Because there's more to the story," Emily replied. "More than what we've told you, more than what's been made public, more than what even the Secretary of Defense knows." She moved to a bookshelf along the far wall, running her fingers along the spines until she found what she was looking for, an old copy of Moby Dick, its binding cracked with age. When she pulled it from the shelf, the entire bookcase swung outward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "My grandfather was a paranoid man," Emily explained, flipping a switch that illuminated the hidden passage. "Growing up during the Cold War left its mark. He believed in having a secure place to store what he called insurance information, too sensitive for regular channels." The 4 visitors exchanged glances, varying degrees of surprise on their faces. Even Dawson, who had known about Operation Clean Sweep, hadn't been aware of this hidden dimension to the Vance family history. "After you," Emily said, gesturing toward the stairs. "It's time you saw what my father and grandfather were really protecting all these years." The hidden room beneath the farmhouse was surprisingly large and meticulously organized. Metal shelving lined the walls, holding dozens of bankers' boxes, each labeled with dates and cryptic alphanumeric codes. A central table supported an older model computer, its chunky monitor covered with a protective cloth. In one corner stood a gun safe, its door ajar to reveal not weapons, but stacks of notebooks and old-style microfiche reels. "What is all this?" Montgomery asked, her voice hushed in the underground space. "My father's legacy," Emily answered, moving to a specific shelf and retrieving a box labeled CS91 Full. "And the real reason men like Hendricks and Whitmore have been so determined to suppress those combat techniques." She placed the box on the table and removed its contents: stacks of photocopied documents, several VHS tapes, and a leather-bound journal similar to the one Dawson had given her. "These are copies of everything my father managed to secure before Operation Clean Sweep buried the original materials," Emily explained. "The complete training manuals from the Iraqi bunker, his personal notes on the techniques, and most importantly, the historical context that explains their true origin." She opened the journal to a marked page, revealing a black-and-white photograph paper-clipped to a handwritten entry. The photo showed a group of women in military-style training attire, their faces serious, their postures displaying the disciplined bearing of soldiers. "These aren't Iraqi women," Emily said, tapping the photograph. "They're American. Specifically, they're members of the Strategic Services Unit, the precursor to the CIA, photographed in 1947 at a classified training facility in Virginia." Mitchell leaned closer, professional interest overriding his surprise. "The SOEOSS integration program," he murmured, recognition dawning in his eyes. "I've heard rumors, but there's almost no documentation." "For good reason," Emily confirmed. "These women were being trained for deep cover operations in environments where their gender would be an advantage, allowing them to move without attracting the kind of attention male operatives would generate. But to be effective, they needed combat capabilities that could overcome the physical advantages of larger opponents. So they developed these techniques," Dawson concluded, the final pieces falling into place, "specifically designed for smaller combatants to neutralize larger ones." "Exactly," Emily nodded. "The program was highly successful. These women carried out dozens of operations throughout the early Cold War period, from Europe to Southeast Asia. Their effectiveness was undeniable. But as the CIA evolved and political climates shifted, the program was gradually phased out. The techniques, however, were preserved in training manuals that circulated within certain intelligence circles. Until they somehow ended up in an Iraqi bunker," Reynolds said, following the thread. "Not somehow," Emily corrected, turning to another page in the journal. "Deliberately. In the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, the United States provided military support to Iraq. Among the materials transferred were training documents including these techniques, though by then they had been classified as experimental and were no longer part of standard doctrine. Saddam adapted them for his own female operatives." Mitchell surmised, his expertise in intelligence matters evident in his quick grasp of the implications. "Creating the unit your father's team discovered during Desert Storm." "Yes," Emily confirmed. "But here's where it gets complicated. The women and the training materials weren't the only things in that bunker. There was also evidence, extensive undeniable evidence, that these techniques had been used in operations against American interests. Operations conducted by women who had been trained using our own methods, women who had succeeded precisely because male American security personnel had underestimated them based on gender." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Montgomery was the first to voice the obvious conclusion. "So Hendricks and Whitmore didn't just suppress these techniques because they opposed women in combat roles," she said slowly. "They buried them because they represented a public relations nightmare. American intelligence methods being used against American interests. And a potential security vulnerability," Mitchell added, his expression grave. "If these techniques became widely known, it would highlight a weakness in our own security posture, the tendency to assess threat levels based on physical size rather than actual capability." Emily nodded. "That's why Operation Clean Sweep wasn't just about removing the training materials from military doctrine. It was about erasing any evidence that these techniques had ever existed, that women had been specifically trained to exploit the blind spots in our security thinking." "But your father preserved it all," Reynolds said, gesturing to the shelves of boxes surrounding them. "Not just the techniques themselves, but the entire historical record." "He believed the truth mattered," Emily replied simply, "and that the techniques themselves were too valuable to be lost because of political considerations. He knew suppressing them wouldn't eliminate the threat. It would only ensure our own forces remained vulnerable to it." Dawson had been examining the other boxes, reading their labels with growing interest. "There's more here than just Operation Clean Sweep," he observed. "These records go back decades, cover multiple operations." "My father didn't start with Clean Sweep," Emily confirmed. "He'd been collecting documentation on classified operations for years, particularly those involving techniques or approaches that were later suppressed for political reasons. The combat methods were just one example of a larger pattern he had identified. A pattern of institutional resistance to anything that challenged conventional military thinking, Mitchell said, nodding slowly. I've seen it myself throughout my career. Good ideas buried because they didn't fit the prevailing doctrine, regardless of their effectiveness. So, what's our next move? Montgomery asked, looking around at the assembled group. We've already achieved more than we initially hoped for. The Secretary of Defense has publicly committed to integrating these techniques into standard training. What more is there to accomplish? Emily closed her father's journal, her expression resolute. We've won the battle for the techniques themselves, but not the war against the mindset that suppressed them. As long as men like Hendricks and Whitmore remain in positions of influence, as long as organizations like the Heritage Warrior Foundation continue to shape policy based on ideology rather than effectiveness, this will happen again. You want to go public with all of it, Dawson realized, gesturing to the room full of classified information. Not just the techniques, but the entire history, the women's program, the transfer to Iraq Operation Clean Sweep, all of it. No, Emily replied, surprising them. Going public would just create a scandal that would eventually fade from memory. I want something more lasting. I want institutional change. She turned to Colonel Mitchell. That's why you're here, Colonel, because you're not just Special Operations Command. You're also on the Joint Special Operations University Curriculum Committee. You have the authority to reshape how the next generation of special operators is trained, not just in physical techniques, but in threat assessment, in recognizing and overcoming unconscious biases, in adapting to an evolving battlefield where traditional assumptions about combat effectiveness no longer apply. Mitchell studied her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. You're not thinking small, Sergeant Vance. You're looking to change the entire paradigm. My father died trying to preserve these techniques, Emily said quietly. My grandfather spent his final years teaching them to me, knowing the military had rejected them. I've proven their effectiveness in the most public way possible. Now I want to ensure that effectiveness isn't just acknowledged, but understood, that the underlying principles become part of our institutional DNA. Reynolds let out a low whistle. When you put it like that, teaching us those moves in the gym seems like a pretty small first step. Every journey begins with a single step, Emily replied with a faint smile. The question now is whether you're all willing to take the next one with me. The four visitors exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. It was Dawson who spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of his decades of service. Thomas Vance tried to do this alone 30 years ago, and the system crushed him, he said solemnly. He didn't have the allies, the evidence, or the moment. You have all three. He straightened to attention, a formal gesture that carried emotional significance. I'm with you, Sergeant. Whatever it takes. As am I, Montgomery added without hesitation. This is bigger than any of our individual careers. It's about the future effectiveness of our entire military. Reynolds nodded his massive head. I'm in. These techniques saved my life last week when we were testing them against multiple opponents. If they can do that for me, imagine what they could do for smaller soldiers who actually need the advantage. All eyes turned to Colonel Mitchell, whose position and influence made his support particularly crucial. The Special Operations Officer was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from the assembled documents to Emily's determined face. What you're proposing goes far beyond modifying a training program, he said finally. You're talking about challenging fundamental assumptions that have shaped military doctrine for generations. The resistance will be substantial. I'm aware of that, sir, Emily replied steadily. Mitchell's expression remained serious, but a glint of something like admiration appeared in his eyes. "My wife is 5'3" and weighs 120 pounds soaking wet," he said, seemingly changing the subject. "She's also a 3-time combat veteran who saved my entire team during an ambush in Kandahar by doing exactly what you demonstrated in that conference room, using superior technique to overcome larger opponents." He extended his hand. "Count me and Sergeant Vance. It's about damn time the institution caught up with the reality that warriors come in all sizes." As they shook hands, sealing an alliance that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier, Emily felt a sense of her father's presence in the room, not as a ghost or supernatural manifestation, but as a continuation of purpose, a vindication of principle, a recognition that what he had fought for had not been in vain. The path ahead would not be easy. The institutional resistance Mitchell had mentioned was real and deeply entrenched. But in this room, surrounded by the evidence her father had preserved and the allies her own actions had garnered, Emily Vance felt something she hadn't experienced since walking into Conference Room B to face 5 opponents selected to end her career. She felt ready. Lieutenant General James Whitmore sat alone in his Pentagon office, bourbon in hand, despite the early hour watching the closed-circuit feed from the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing on his secure monitor. The title displayed on the C-SPAN chyron made his stomach churn. Hearing on Combat Effectiveness Standards and Gender Integration in Special Operations Forces. On screen, Colonel Mitchell was testifying, his measured, authoritative tone carrying easily through the chamber as he addressed the assembled senators. "The integrated combat system represents not merely an addition to our training methodology, but a fundamental reevaluation of how we define combat effectiveness," Mitchell was saying. "For too long, we have relied on metrics that prioritize raw physical power over technique, precision, and adaptability. The evidence now available to us suggests this has been a significant oversight, one that has potentially limited our operational capabilities and excluded qualified individuals from serving in roles where they could make valuable contributions." Senator Elizabeth Harlow, chair of the committee, leaned forward. "Colonel Mitchell, are you suggesting that the physical standards for Special Operations Forces should be lowered to accommodate female candidates?" "No, Senator, I am not," Mitchell replied firmly. "I am suggesting that our understanding of what constitutes an effective combatant needs to be expanded. The physical standards we currently employ measure specific attributes: upper body strength, load-bearing capacity, endurance under specific conditions. These remain relevant, but they do not account for other equally important factors such as tactical adaptability, precision in technique application, and the ability to neutralize larger opponents through superior skill. And you believe these factors can compensate for disparities in physical size and strength?" Another senator asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "I don't believe it, Senator." "I know it," Mitchell answered. "I've seen it demonstrated conclusively, not only in controlled training environments but in actual combat situations. The integrated combat system techniques have been field-tested by special operations personnel over the past month with remarkable results. Operators trained in these methods have shown significantly improved performance in close-quarters scenarios, regardless of their physical size." The camera panned to show Staff Sergeant Emily Vance seated behind Mitchell, her uniform immaculate, her posture perfect, her expression professionally neutral, despite being the focus of national attention. Beside her sat Sergeant Reynolds, his massive frame providing a visual counterpoint that silently reinforced Mitchell's testimony. Whitmore took another swallow of bourbon, the burn in his throat doing nothing to alleviate the cold dread settling in his stomach. This hearing was supposed to have been a formality, a bureaucratic hurdle to be navigated, before the Vance incident could be quietly contained. Instead, it had become a platform for Mitchell, one of the most respected special operations officers in the service, to publicly endorse not just the techniques themselves, but the entire philosophical framework that Whitmore had spent decades opposing. His secure phone rang a direct line used only by a select few individuals. The caller ID displayed Hendricks, and Whitmore briefly considered ignoring it. Richard Hendricks had proven remarkably useless in containing this situation, his ham-fisted attempt to humiliate Vance backfiring in the most spectacular fashion possible. But perhaps the colonel had finally found a way to salvage something from this disaster. Whitmore picked up on the fourth ring. "This better be important, Richard," he said without preamble. "I'm watching our careers circling the drain on national television." "Sir, we have a problem," Hendricks replied, his voice tight with suppressed panic. "Someone accessed the Operation Clean Sweep files." Whitmore froze the bourbon glass halfway to his lips. "That's not possible. Those files were purged 30 years ago." "The electronic records were purged," Hendricks clarified. "But it seems Thomas Vance made physical copies before the operation was classified. His daughter has them, all of them. The training manuals, the after-action reports, the original assessment of the Iraqi women's unit. Everything." "How do you know this?" Whitmore demanded, his mind racing through implications, calculating damage control scenarios. "One of my contacts at Fort Bragg observed Vance and several others visiting the old Vance family farm yesterday," Hendricks explained. "They spent several hours there, then left with boxes of materials. When my contact investigated afterward, he found a hidden room under the farmhouse empty, except for some shelving and a computer." Whitmore's free hand clenched into a fist. "And you're only telling me this now?" "I only confirmed it an hour ago," Hendricks said defensively. "And there's more. The materials weren't just about clean sweep. According to my contact, there were dozens of boxes labeled with operation names going back to the 1960s. Thomas Vance apparently had a hobby of collecting documentation on classified operations, particularly ones with problematic elements. The implications were staggering. If Thomas Vance had indeed been collecting sensitive materials for decades, if his daughter now possessed that collection and was sharing it with others, the potential for damage extended far beyond the current controversy about combat techniques. "Where is Vance now?" Whitmore asked, his voice deadly calm. "At the Senate hearing with Mitchell," Hendricks replied, "but she's scheduled to return to Fort Bragg tonight." Whitmore was silent for a long moment, weighing options, calculating risks. Throughout his career, he had faced numerous challenges to his authority. His vision for the military, his understanding of what constituted effective warfare. He had overcome all of them through a combination of political acumen, strategic thinking, and, when necessary, ruthless action. But this situation was different. The public narrative had already shifted. The Secretary of Defense had publicly endorsed the integrated combat system. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs was personally involved in the implementation process. And now a Senate committee was providing a national platform for Mitchell and Vance to further legitimize their approach. Direct opposition was no longer viable. But perhaps there was another way to contain the damage. "Richard," Whitmore said finally, "I need you to arrange a meeting with Sergeant Vance, tonight when she returns to Fort Bragg. Just the three of us." "Sir." Hendricks sounded uncertain. "Given the current climate, I'm not sure that's advisable." "It's not a request, Colonel," Whitmore replied coldly. "Make it happen." He ended the call without waiting for a response, turning his attention back to the hearing on his monitor. Mitchell was now demonstrating some of the techniques using Reynolds as his partner to show how leverage and positioning could neutralize significant size advantages. The senators watched with evident interest, several taking notes, others leaning forward to better observe the demonstration. Whitmore finished his bourbon in a single swallow, the familiar burn doing nothing to dispel the cold calculation taking shape in his mind. For 30 years, he had protected the secrets of Operation Clean Sweep, not just to preserve his own career, but to maintain a specific vision of American military power. A vision that prioritized strength dominance and clear hierarchies of capability. That vision was now under direct threat. And James Whitmore had not risen to the rank of lieutenant general by surrendering when threatened. As Emily Vance appeared on screen again, responding to a senator's question about the historical context of the techniques Whitmore studied, her face searching for weaknesses, for pressure points, for the vulnerabilities that every soldier, no matter how capable, inevitably possessed. He would find them. He always did. The Senate hearing concluded late in the afternoon, with the committee chairwoman expressing strong support for the integrated combat system and requesting regular updates on its implementation across the service branches. Emily Reynolds and Colonel Mitchell were escorted from the Capitol by military aides, their transportation already arranged for the return to Fort Bragg. "That went better than expected," Mitchell observed as their car navigated the Washington traffic. Senator Harlow practically endorsed the program on the spot. "The demonstration helped," Reynolds said with a grin. "When you flipped me onto that mat, I thought Senator Jenkins was going to have a heart attack." Emily smiled faintly at the memory. The demonstration had indeed been effective, particularly when the 6'6", 280-pound Reynolds had been smoothly taken down by the 5'10", 170-pound Mitchell using one of the integrated combat system's core techniques. "Visual evidence is powerful," she agreed. "But the statistics you presented were equally important, Colonel. 8 weeks of implementation with Special Operations trainees and a 37% improvement in close-quarters effectiveness scores. That's the kind of data that changes minds." Mitchell nodded, his expression turning more serious. "The battle for institutional adoption is well underway, but we need to discuss what happens next with the additional materials." The additional materials was their coded reference to the documents Emily had retrieved from her grandfather's farm, the extensive collection of classified information that Thomas Vance had accumulated over his career, focusing particularly on operations and programs that had been suppressed for political rather than operational reasons. "I've secured them in a location only I know," Emily replied. "For now, I think it's best if they remain our insurance policy rather than an active component of the strategy." "Agreed," Mitchell said. "The techniques themselves are gaining acceptance on their own merits. Introducing the more contentious historical elements would only complicate matters at this stage." Reynolds looked between them, a question forming in his expression. "But eventually the full history needs to come out right. The women's program from the 1940s, the transfer to Iraq, Operation Clean Sweep, all of it." "Eventually," Emily confirmed, "but timing matters. Right now, the focus needs to remain on implementation and integration. Once the integrated combat system is firmly established as doctrine, the historical context can be introduced as part of a broader educational initiative." Their car pulled into Andrews Air Force Base, where a military transport awaited to return them to Fort Bragg. As they boarded the aircraft, Emily's phone buzzed with a text message from Lieutenant Montgomery. "Heads up! Hendricks requesting meeting upon your return. Says Whitmore will be there. Mandatory attendance. 2100 hours, base commander's office." Emily showed the message to Mitchell, whose expression darkened. "Whitmore doesn't strike me as the type to concede gracefully," the colonel observed. "This feels like a trap." "Almost certainly," Emily agreed. "But avoiding it would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Better to face it directly with the momentum of today's hearing behind us." "You shouldn't go alone," Reynolds said, concern evident in his voice. "I won't be," Emily replied, glancing at Mitchell. Colonel, Mitchell nodded without hesitation. I'll be there. Whitmore outranks me, but my position at Special Operations Command gives me some latitude. And after today's hearing, he can't easily dismiss my involvement without raising questions. The flight to Fort Bragg was brief but tense, each of them aware that despite the public victories they had achieved, the institutional resistance remained powerful. Men like Whitmore and Hendricks had spent decades accumulating influence, building networks, establishing mechanisms to protect their vision of the military. They would not surrender that vision without employing every weapon in their considerable arsenal. As the aircraft began its descent toward Fort Bragg, Emily found herself thinking of her father, of his quiet integrity, his commitment to principles over politics, his willingness to sacrifice his own career rather than participate in the suppression of valuable knowledge. She wondered what advice he would give her now, facing a direct confrontation with the man who had effectively ended his military career. The answer came to her with surprising clarity, not as a memory of specific words, but as an understanding of his fundamental approach. Stand your ground. Speak truth. Remember that institutions are ultimately composed of individuals, and individuals can change when presented with compelling evidence. By the time they landed, Emily had formulated her approach for the meeting with Whitmore and Hendricks. It would not be confrontational, despite the temptation to hold them accountable for past actions. It would not be accusatory, despite the legitimate grievances she could raise. Instead, it would be forward-looking, focused on the shared goal of enhancing military effectiveness, offering them a path to alignment with the changes that were already underway. Whether they would take that path remained to be seen. The base commander's office was illuminated only by a desk lamp when Emily and Colonel Mitchell arrived at precisely 2100 hours. The commander himself was notably absent, having apparently surrendered his space to the two officers who waited within Colonel Hendricks, standing stiffly by the window, and Lieutenant General Whitmore seated behind the desk, as if it were his own. Sergeant Vance, Whitmore acknowledged his gaze, flickering briefly to Mitchell, with barely concealed annoyance. Colonel Mitchell, I wasn't aware this meeting included you. As the Special Operations Command liaison for the Integrated Combat System implementation, I felt my presence might be valuable, Mitchell replied smoothly, given the subject matter. Whitmore's lips thinned, but he didn't challenge the explanation. Very well. Please, both of you be seated. Emily and Mitchell took the chairs positioned before the desk, neither betraying any sign of the tension that hung in the air like static electricity before a storm. I'll come directly to the point, Whitmore said after a moment of silence. The situation has evolved in ways none of us anticipated. The Secretary of Defense has made his position clear. The Senate Armed Services Committee appears supportive. The techniques you've championed, Sergeant Vance, are being integrated into training protocols across multiple service branches. He spread his hands in a gesture that might have appeared conciliatory if not for the calculating coldness in his eyes. In light of these developments, I believe it's time to put aside our differences and focus on ensuring this transition occurs in a manner that maintains operational readiness and unit cohesion. Emily maintained her neutral expression, though internally she was analyzing every word, every nuance of Whitmore's unexpected olive branch. This was not the confrontation she had anticipated, which meant it was potentially more dangerous. I appreciate that perspective, sir, she replied carefully. Integration of the integrated combat system into existing training frameworks is indeed the priority at this stage. I'm glad we agree, Whitmore said, his tone suggesting this was a significant concession on his part. Which brings me to the purpose of this meeting. There are certain historical elements that might complicate this integration if they were to become widely known. Elements that, while perhaps historically interesting, add little value to the current implementation process. And there it was, the real purpose behind this unexpected rapprochement. Whitmore wasn't conceding defeat. He was attempting to contain the damage to Operation Clean Sweep and the broader pattern of suppression that Emily's father had documented. "You're referring to the origin of these techniques," Emily said, not a question but a statement. "The women's program from the 1940s, the transfer to Iraq, the discovery during Desert Storm." Whitmore's expression remained neutral, but a slight tension in his jaw betrayed his surprise at her direct acknowledgement. "Among other things, yes. Those historical details, while perhaps academically interesting, could unnecessarily politicize what should be a purely tactical discussion about combat effectiveness." "You mean they could raise questions about why these techniques were suppressed for 30 years? Mitchell interjected, his tone conversational, but his eyes sharp. "About the institutional resistance to evidence-based changes in doctrine, when those changes challenged conventional thinking about who could be effective in combat roles." Hendricks shifted uncomfortably by the window, but Whitmore's expression remained composed. "The past is the past, Colonel. Decisions were made in different times, under different circumstances, with the information available at that moment. What matters now is moving forward in a unified manner." Emily studied the general reading between the carefully chosen words. "You're proposing a compromise. You'll support the integration of the techniques if we agree to keep the historical context confidential." "I'm proposing a practical approach," Whitmore corrected smoothly, "one that focuses on the future rather than relitigating the past. The techniques are being adopted. That's a victory for your perspective, Sergeant Vance. Why complicate it with historical controversies that add nothing to the tactical value of what's being implemented?" It was on its surface a reasonable argument. The techniques were indeed being adopted. The primary goal Emily had set out to achieve was well on its way to realization. Did the historical context, the women's program, Operation Clean Sweep, her father's struggle, really matter in practical terms? The answer came to her with absolute clarity. Yes, it mattered profoundly. "With respect, General," Emily said, her voice quiet but firm. "The historical context isn't just an academic footnote. It's a case study in how institutional biases can lead to the suppression of valuable knowledge when that knowledge challenges prevailing assumptions. Understanding that history is essential to ensuring it doesn't happen again, not just with these techniques, but with any innovation that doesn't align with conventional thinking." Whitmore's expression hardened slightly. "That's a rather idealistic position, Sergeant. The practical reality is that introducing these historical elements will create unnecessary controversy at a critical implementation phase." "I disagree, sir," Mitchell interjected. "As someone responsible for that implementation, I believe understanding the full context enhances rather than detracts from the process. It provides valuable insights into the resistance these techniques may face at various levels, and offers strategies for overcoming that resistance based on historical precedent." Whitmore's gaze shifted between them, reassessing the situation. He had clearly expected Emily to be alone, possibly intimidated by his rank and authority. Instead, he faced not only a prepared and resolute sergeant, but a full colonel with Special Operations Command backing. "I see," he said finally, his tone cooling noticeably. "Then let me be more direct. The materials your father collected, Sergeant Vance, they contain classified information spanning decades of operations. Possession of those materials by unauthorized personnel constitutes a serious security breach. Under different circumstances, it could result in court-martial proceedings." And there it was, the threat barely concealed beneath the veneer of compromise. Emily had anticipated this, had prepared for it, but the reality of a three-star general essentially threatening her with prosecution still sent a chill through her spine. "Those materials are no longer in my possession, sir," she replied calmly. "They've been properly secured through appropriate channels." This was technically true. The morning after retrieving the documents from her grandfather's farm, Emily had transferred them to Colonel Mitchell, who had official clearance to handle classified materials of that nature. Mitchell had then secured them within Special Operations Command's classified storage facilities, properly logged and documented, making the entire collection officially part of the military's historical record. Whitmore's eyes narrowed, sensing the maneuver, but not yet grasping its full implications. "Secured through what channels exactly?" "Mine, General," Mitchell answered. "As the Special Operations Historical Documentation Officer, I have the authority to receive and secure classified materials relevant to Special Operations history. Sergeant Vance properly transferred all materials to my custody, where they were logged, catalogued, and secured according to all applicable regulations." The silence that followed was absolute. Hendricks looked as if he might be ill. Whitmore's expression had frozen into a mask of controlled fury as he processed the elegant trap that had just been sprung. By transferring the materials through official channels, Emily and Mitchell had transformed what Whitmore had hoped to frame as a security breach into a legitimate historical preservation action. The documents weren't contraband. They were now official military historical records, subject to all the protections and processes that status entailed. "I see," Whitmore said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. "And I suppose these historical records are now being prepared for inclusion in training materials." "Not at this stage," Emily replied honestly. "As we discussed earlier, the current focus is on technical implementation. The historical context will be introduced gradually as part of a broader educational initiative once the techniques themselves are firmly established." She leaned forward slightly, her posture respectful but her gaze unflinching. "General Whitmore, this doesn't have to be adversarial. You have an opportunity to be part of a significant positive change in how we train American warfighters. Your experience, your influence, your understanding of the institutional landscape, these could be invaluable in ensuring these techniques are integrated effectively." It was an olive branch of her own genuine, despite the circumstances. Emily had no interest in creating enemies or tarnishing legacies. Her goal remained what it had always been, ensuring that effective combat techniques were available to all qualified personnel regardless of size, gender, or conformity to traditional physical ideals. Whitmore studied her for a long moment, his calculating mind visibly reassessing the situation, evaluating new options, considering potential paths forward. Emily had expected continued resistance, perhaps even escalation of the threats. What she hadn't expected was the tired sigh that finally escaped the general's lips, or the slight slump of his shoulders as some internal battle appeared to reach its conclusion. 30 years, he said, his voice softer than before, almost reflective. For 30 years, I've maintained that physical strength and size were non-negotiable prerequisites for effective close-quarters combat. I've shaped policy, influenced doctrine, redirected resources, all based on that fundamental belief. He glanced at the window, though in the darkness outside, he could see only his own reflection. "And then you walk into a conference room and dismantle 5 of our most physically imposing soldiers in less time than it takes to recite the Pledge of Allegiance." Whitmore turned back to Emily, something different in his eyes now, not surrender, not quite acceptance, but perhaps a grudging recognition. "You've won, Sergeant Vance, not just tactically, but strategically. The techniques will be adopted. The historical context will eventually emerge. The paradigm will shift." "It's not about winning, sir," Emily replied quietly. "It's about effectiveness, about ensuring every qualified soldier has access to the best possible training regardless of physical attributes. Whitmore nodded slightly, though whether in agreement or mere acknowledgement was unclear. Perhaps, but victory or not, you've achieved your objective. The question now is what happens next, not just with the techniques or the historical records, but with those of us who resisted the change. There was the real question finally exposed. Whitmore wasn't concerned about the techniques anymore. That battle was lost. He was concerned about his legacy, about how history would remember his role in Operation Clean Sweep and the subsequent decades of suppression. "That depends largely on you, sir," Emily said honestly. "The historical record will reflect what happened, but how that history is interpreted, what context is provided, what emphasis is placed on various elements that can be influenced by your actions moving forward." "You're suggesting I publicly support the integration," Whitmore surmised. "I'm suggesting you contribute your expertise to ensuring it happens effectively," Emily corrected. "Your experience is valuable, General. Your understanding of the institutional challenges, the potential resistance points, the strategies for overcoming them, these could significantly enhance the implementation process." It was a genuine offer, not a political maneuver. Despite everything that had happened, Emily recognized the practical value Whitmore could bring to the implementation effort. His decades of experience, his network of contacts, his understanding of military bureaucracy, these were assets that could accelerate the integration of the integrated combat system across service branches. Whitmore appeared to recognize the sincerity of the offer. He was silent for a long moment, weighing options, calculating costs and benefits, evaluating this unexpected path forward. "I'll need time to consider," he said finally. "This represents a significant adjustment to my position." "Of course, sir," Emily replied. "The implementation team meets weekly at Special Operations Command. Colonel Mitchell can provide details if you decide to participate." Whitmore nodded, then rose from the desk, a clear signal that the meeting was concluded. "Sergeant Vance, Colonel Mitchell, thank you for your time." As they left the office, Emily couldn't help but reflect on the unexpected turn the confrontation had taken. She had anticipated threats, resistance, perhaps even outright hostility. Instead, she had witnessed something rarer and ultimately more significant, the beginning of a potential transformation in thinking from one of the system's most entrenched defenders. Whether that transformation would continue, whether Whitmore would ultimately embrace the paradigm shift or simply adapt to it strategically, remained to be seen. But the fact that he was considering it at all represented a victory more meaningful than any official adoption of techniques or public endorsement from military leadership. It represented the possibility that institutions could change not just in policy or procedure, but in fundamental perspective. That deeply held beliefs, even those maintained for decades, could evolve when confronted with compelling evidence. That the future of warfare might indeed be shaped by effectiveness rather than tradition. As Emily and Mitchell walked across the darkened base, the night air cool on their faces, a sense of completion settled over her. The journey that had begun in Conference Room B facing 5 opponents selected to end her career had evolved into something far larger than she had ever anticipated. The techniques her father had preserved, that her grandfather had taught her, that she had demonstrated in those crucial 83 seconds, they would now become part of standard military doctrine available to generations of soldiers to come. "Your father would be proud," Mitchell said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've accomplished it." Emily nodded, thinking of the photograph that still sat on her nightstand, Thomas Vance in his dress uniform, his expression serious, but his eyes kind. The picture had been taken just before his final deployment, before the cancer diagnosis, before everything changed. "He believed the truth would eventually prevail," she replied, That effectiveness would ultimately matter more than ideology or tradition. I'm not sure he expected it to take 30 years, but he never lost faith that it would happen eventually. They reached the point where their paths diverged, Mitchell toward the visiting officers' quarters, Emily toward her own barracks. "What will you do now?" Mitchell asked. With the integrated combat system on track for full implementation, with the historical record secured with Whitmore potentially coming on board, what's next for Staff Sergeant Emily Vance? Emily smiled slightly, looking up at the stars visible in the clear North Carolina sky. "There's still work to do. Implementation is just the beginning. Training instructors, developing curricula, ensuring the techniques are properly integrated into existing combat frameworks. That's at least a year's effort, probably more." "And after that," Mitchell pressed, Emily considered the question, thinking not just of her immediate future, but of the larger mission her father had begun, and she had continued. "There are other techniques in those records," she said finally. "Other approaches that were suppressed not because they were ineffective, but because they challenged conventional thinking. Reconnaissance methodologies, intelligence-gathering techniques, even leadership approaches that emphasized different qualities than the traditional command model." She turned to face Mitchell directly. "My father didn't just preserve these combat techniques, Colonel. He preserved an entire alternative approach to warfare, one based on evidence rather than tradition, on effectiveness rather than convention. I think there's more work to be done in bringing that approach to light." Mitchell studied her for a moment, then nodded with a smile. "I think you're right, Sergeant, and I think you're just the person to do it." As they parted ways, Emily felt the weight of her rifle against her back, the weapon that Hendricks had demanded she surrender in Conference Room B, the symbol of her identity as a soldier, the tool that had saved lives in 3 combat deployments. They had taken away her rifle thinking it would leave her vulnerable. Instead, it had revealed a strength they hadn't anticipated, a capability that transcended weaponry, that resided in knowledge preserved through generations, in techniques refined through thousands of hours of practice. In those 83 seconds without her rifle, Emily Vance had not only secured her own future, she had begun to reshape the future of warfare itself. And that, she knew, was a legacy her father would have considered worthy of his sacrifice. The future stretched before her, filled with possibilities that had seemed unimaginable just weeks earlier. Whatever challenges it held, whatever resistance remained to be overcome, Emily Vance would face it as she had faced those 5 opponents in Conference Room B, ready, focused, and absolutely certain of her capabilities.